What is going on, YouTube fam bam? How we doing today? Hope everybody's doing great out there. If you're in North Texas here in the past week, hope everybody stayed warm. It was freezing, lots of snow, ice, all kinds of craziness. But anyways, hope you're doing great. We are in a little bit of a different environment. I'm sitting in my kitchen. Whenever the bodies of water that you fish on freeze, and you're not familiar with ice fishing and you don't want to fall through the ice, you do a lure review or lure informational, if you will. So that's the goal for today. First of all, this is not all inclusive. This is based on strictly my experience, my knowledge with fishing thus far. So if you see this and something was misspoken or not included, please be merciful and gracious and politely correct me or just let it go. The goal of today's video is just to educate you, the viewer, who may or may not know anything about fishing. I don't know. But just to educate you a little bit in regards to the lures that are specifically used in bass fishing. Most cases are used in freshwater. There's lots of vocabulary, lots of lingo with fishing lures, different types, different purposes, different imitations, etc., etc. So it can get kind of overwhelming when you think about all the ins and the outs. So the goal today is just to strictly present, again, to my knowledge, the different groups, the different types. I do have some demos of most of these baits that I'll go ahead and show you as well. It was done in my bathtub, so forgive me if you're looking for some professional footage. I mean, it's pretty simple, but I did my best to try and give you an idea of what it looks like under the water, help you better understand kind of what that lure imitates. So let's get into it. So within the world of lures, there's a couple of things that I wanted to discuss in this video. Hard plastics, soft plastics, swim baits, topwater baits, spinner baits, jigs, and trailers. So 7 different, I guess, categories or things I want to discuss. Within each of those 7 categories, there's different types. So it can get really extensive, but I'm gonna try and keep it towards the surface. First in the lineup, we're gonna go ahead and walk through the term soft plastics. So obviously, the term soft implies they're soft, right? So these are all the plastics, most of the plastics that I have in my tackle box. They are all soft, right? They're all really stretchy. They're malleable, they're squishy. You can mess with them, pull on them, stretch on them. When you hear the term soft plastic, it's anything that, again, is soft, stretchy, squishy, things like that. First in the lineup that we're gonna talk about is, this is a Zoom trick worm. There's nothing too special about it. It's just a straight worm, nothing crazy. This is primarily utilized with a Texas rig, which is, to be simply put, you have a weight with a hook and the hook goes into the worm, and then that weight makes the worm go to the bottom. And so this is a bait that you utilize to bump on and off the bottom. Very common, easy, simple fish is a Texas rig soft plastic. You can pretty much Texas rig most of these. With the exception to the swim bait, they're pretty much fished very similar. Soft plastic number 1, that's a Zoom trick worm. I'm sure there's different names for it, but just straightforward, looks very similar to your earthworm. Next soft plastic we're going to talk about is, again, it's a worm, but this one has a ribbon tail. So you can see the ribbon tail there. So this is, again, utilized with a Texas rig, very similar to the trick worm. However, this ribbon tail, when it swims through the water, that thing, creates movement and it twists, and it can be something that catches a fish's eye. So I have seen people with ribbon tail soft plastics, I have seen people swim them back. Swimming them back meaning a constant retrieve, right? If you're bumping it up and off the bottom, you're working the rod tip, reeling every now and then, things like that. I have seen people swim this back. So this would be what you would call a ribbon tail soft plastic worm. Next on the list I want to discuss is another worm, clearly. But this is what you call a Senko. So when you hear Senko, it's not quite as wiry as the trick worm, but that is what when you hear the word Senko, that's what it is. Again, this can be used with a Texas rig, bouncing up and off the bottom. You can also, what you call is wacky rig this, which is simply you have a hook. A lot of people do it weightless, a hook with no weight, and you hook it through the middle of the worm like this. And then as you bounce it, it just gives the worm a different look. So this is another soft plastic. This is called a Senko. Very effective way to fish. Wacky rigging a Senko. If nothing else is working, a lot of times, man, that'll cause those bass, they just can't resist it, and you'll probably get a couple hits if you wacky rig a Senko. Up next is what you call a flat tail worm. You can see, obviously, that tail is flat, right? Similar to, the tail of a beaver, if you will. Kind of looks similar. Again, this is just another version of a soft plastic worm. Gives it a little bit of a different action. This does have some action if you were to swim this back, so I've seen people swim these as well. But yeah, again, the Texas rig is an effective way to fish this bait. You bump it up and off the bottom. Pretty simple way to fish, and one that is recommended for any angler. But if you are looking, you kind of have no idea what you're doing and you want something that's going to be effective, a Texas rigged soft plastic worm is going to be the way to go. So this would be a flat tail plastic worm. Up next on the list is a salamander, or I guess you could call that a lizard, depending on who you talk to. Okay, it's got these little arms, legs, and then this tail. Lots of action in the water, right? So again, some bass, man, they just want something simple like that trick worm, kind of wiry. Others, they need a little more enticing, right? These legs, all that moves a lot in that water, whether you're bumping it on the bottom or obviously, again, I have seen people swim these back and a bass will eat it. Again, Texas rig is the primary use, I believe, of the salamander, at least in my experience. It's really effective. And again, all these legs, appendages, this tail, right? It has a ribbon tail on it. All that movement, man, the bass really, it's hard for them to resist that. The salamander, the lizard, is another great soft plastic to Texas rig. Next, let's talk about the Fluke. This is a soft plastic split tail fluke. Split tail because if you look at the tail, there's a fork in it, right? It's split. There's different types of flukes. This is probably, I guess in my opinion, my knowledge and experience, the most common is a split tail fluke. This here resembles what you would call a shad, which is a very common bait fish for bass. They're kind of long, slender, usually a lighter color like this. And it's slow sinking, and the way you work this back is you kind of pop it every now and then, and it's so light when you do that, it darts around, right? It's really erratic in its movement, and that resembles a shad that's in distress. Okay, well, a bass isn't gonna pass up, a meal that's easy, right? One that's maybe injured or in distress. And so when you do that, when you bump it like that, the bass really key in on that and they take advantage of it. So this is what you would call soft plastic fluke. Again, resembles a shad. Another soft plastic that's really common is a craw, right? Or a crawfish. Okay, it's got the pinchers here, the whiskers in the front. This one has a couple sets of legs. This is obviously a very realistic and effective bait if you're trying to resemble a crawfish. This can also be Texas rigged. I've seen people swim these back as all these legs and the pinchers, man, that they really work in the water. They work really well. Obviously, I don't know if you've seen, but when a real crawfish swims away, they use their tail, right, and they paddle backwards. So a crawfish, swimming this way through the water would not be uncommon when it comes to what a bass would see for a crawfish moving either along the bottom or swimming around. So this is a soft plastic craw, very effective bait, and one that can be utilized in a lot of different ways. Another soft plastic is a paddle tail swim bait. We're going to get into this a little bit later on. I mentioned soft plastics and swim baits as separate categories. They are, in a sense, but you can have soft plastic swim bait. It can be the same thing. When you hear someone reference a swim bait, a lot of times they're referencing a soft plastic paddle tail. There's a couple other swim baits that we'll go over a little bit later, but this is an example of that. This paddle tail obviously creates movement with that, and the retrieve just looks like a fish swimming in the water. So get into it a little bit later. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our hard plastics, right? These baits are obviously the opposite of soft plastics in the fact that they're rigid, they're not stretchy, they're not malleable, they're hard baits, right? And so these are going to be the ones that primarily do a lot of swimming through the water, a lot of kind of faster retrieves. Most of the soft plastics are typically a little more relaxed fish. You hear the term finesse, right? You're not casting out there, reeling back in. You're not covering a ton of water usually with those soft plastics. With hard plastics, the goal is to cover a lot of water, make a lot of casts, and find out where those fish are. So let's get into it. Another thing I want to mention about the hard plastics is there's three categories usually. You have floating, you have sinking, and you have suspending. Each one of those obviously mean exactly what the word is. So suspending would be, let's say you get a hard bait 2 foot under the water and you stop reeling in, it'll stop right there and it'll suspend at 2 feet. If you get it to 5 feet, it'll suspend at 5 feet. Obviously sinking is when you throw it out there and you don't retrieve it If you don't mess with it, it will sink. Floating will be the opposite. Obviously, it stays on top of the water until you begin to reel it in, and at that point, it can dive or stay on top of whatever lure you're choosing. But floating, suspending, and sinking, those are your three categories when it comes to hard baits. First on the hard bait list is going to be a crankbait, which is this little guy right here. There's lots of different options when it comes to crankbaits. When you hear crankbait, this little bill right here is going to give it away. They make lots of different sizes of these. The bigger the bill, the deeper that crankbait will dive. This is specifically a floating one. So when you cast this out and you don't mess with it, it'll float on top of the water. When you begin to reel in, this bill catches the water and it causes it to sink. This is a smaller bill, so I think this one is maybe 3 to 6 feet. And so when you hear crankbait, this bill is what you're looking for. Again, it's designed to dive down as you're retrieving it. As you'll see in the demo, it's a tight wobble. This one is, I believe. But when you hear crankbait, anything with a bill on the front is going to be a crankbait. This bill can be really, really big and round. It can be really, really short. This is kind of a hybrid between a square bill and a round bill. Lots of different options here. This particular one also has a rattle. Okay, creates a lot of noise. Bass like that and they come check it out. Most times they eat it. Great, effective bait. So when you think of crankbait, this little guy right here. Next, we're going to talk about the lipless crankbait. And it's exactly what it is. It is very similar to a crankbait, but it is lipless. It does not have a bill on the front. Most of these, at least in my experience, are sinking. I honestly don't know of a lipless crankbait that's floating or suspending. This allows you to fish a crankbait style bait in the sense that they're pretty similar in their movement, especially a smaller bill crankbait. In this one, this is going to be an even tighter wobble back and forth. And what this one does is this allows you to fish it at a lot of different levels in the water column. So you can fish this depending on how fast you retrieve it at 2 feet under the surface, at 6 feet, 7 feet, 25 feet, 30 feet. However fast you retrieve this lure is going to be how deep you'll fish it. A lot of times with these crankbaits, with the bill, it kind of determines that for you. You don't have as much flexibility with how deep you can fish them. I used this bait a lot this winter. In some of my other videos, I use a red one actually. In and out of grass, man, those bass can't resist it. Caught a lot of fish on a lipless crankbait. So crankbait, very similar to a lipless crankbait. Obviously, doesn't have a lip on it. So very, very effective bait though. Next on the list is a rattle trap, very similar to a lipless crankbait. It is a little more streamlined, kind of longer and skinnier. The movements are very similar. It's going to be a tight wobble, right? This one also has, lots of rattles, right? It's a rattle trap. Very similar to the lipless crankbait, can be just as effective. I would say these are interchangeable in my opinion. I mean, there's not a crazy amount of difference between the two. Just kind of depends on who you talk to. But this bait, as well as this lipless crankbait, there's more than one way to retrieve these. They're designed for constant retrieve because they do sink, so you do need to be reeling them in for them to be effective. You can also yo-yo these. Yo-yos go up and down, okay? So these can be yo-yoed back. So you can yo-yo it up with your rod tip and then let it sink, right? Let it sink. Let it sink. That's just one other way to give the bait a different look, if you will. So keep that in mind. These are both constant retrieve baits. So when you hear rattle trap, very similar to the lipless crankbait, just normally a little bit longer, a little bit skinnier in profile. Next hard bait we're going to discuss is the jerk bait. Okay, long skinny bait, bunch of hooks. So this is a jerk bait. Similar to a crankbait, it does have a bill on the front, and that is designed obviously to get it under the water. As you move this lure, that bill catches the water and causes it to dive. So the jerk bait method, or how you fish this bait, is in the name. You jerk this bait with your rod tip. Most jerk bait patterns is you're reeling in and then you jerk it pretty aggressively 2 times and then you pause, right? You jerk it 2 times and you pause, and reeling obviously in there as well. But and what that does, it creates a really erratic movement, similar to the Fluke, how the Fluke's just really calm and all of a sudden it boom, boom, it darts and dives and whatever else. That's what this jerk bait does, and it again resembles, a shad in distress or fish in distress. Great wintertime bait. I've caught a few fish on this particular jerk bait. Really effective way to catch fish in the wintertime. So yeah, when you think of jerk bait, typically they're long, skinny, lots of hooks. So if you do catch a bass on these, be mindful of that. Instead of, it's not like a Texas rig where you have one hook to worry about. You've literally got 9 different hooks to make sure don't get in your hand. But this is a jerk bait, very effective way to resemble a fish that's in distress. Now we're going to talk about swim baits. Again, this is not all inclusive, but a swim bait is any bait that is designed to swim through the water. Yes, you could say, well, doesn't the crankbait and rattle trap, are those considered swim baits? I would say no. A swim bait is, most of the time, it's a bait that looks like a fish that's swimming. It's very simple and elementary, but that's what it is. So like I mentioned earlier, this would be a soft plastic paddle tail swim bait. So what happens with this is this paddle tail, obviously in the water, that paddle tail catches the water and it causes this bait to wibble and wobble back and forth. Really effective way to catch fish. In my demo of this, I just threw this weightless. A lot of people will utilize a jig head hook or a weighted hook to kind of give this thing a little more control, make it a little more streamlined. This would be an example of a swim bait. Another version of a swim bait would be a segmented swim bait, which would be this guy right here. Okay, this is another little swim bait here. And again, the retrieve of it, it looks like it's swimming. So specifically with these segments, right, this goes back and forth in the water. This actually looks very realistic. This is slow sinking, so this is a lure, and similar to the paddle tail, depending on how you retrieve them. You can work different levels in the water column. You can shallower, deeper, however you see fit. But when you hear swim bait, typically that's a bait that looks and swims like a fish. Pretty self-explanatory, but when you hear swim baits, these two guys are going to be pretty similar to what you're going to see. Up next, we're going to be talking about jigs and chatterbaits, only because, in my opinion, they're pretty similar, obviously with the exception to the blade on the chatterbait. So when I say chatterbait, this is the bait that I'm referencing right here. This bait is a super versatile bait. You can do a ton with this bait. You can fish it fast, you can fish it slow. You can bump this along the bottom if you want to. But this jig, this blade right here, when this gets pulled through the water, that vibrates back and forth and creates a lot of vibration. Most people fish these with, we're gonna talk about trailers here in a second, but this soft plastic bait right here, this is a trailer. These legs, right, they work in the back as the blade works in the front. Some people can, you don't have to fish these with trailers. I've seen people fish them without trailers. Some people prefer not to fish them with trailers. But when you hear chatterbait or bladed jig, this is what they're referencing. This is going to be this metal plate at the front that, as you reel it, creates a lot of vibration. If you're throwing this with the right rod, which would be medium heavy, fast action, in that range, you'll feel that vibrating as you retrieve it. So this is a chatterbait, super effective bait. I use this a ton on my channel. This for me this past year during the spring. I mean, I almost exclusively threw a chatterbait. If it wasn't working, I moved on to different baits, but I had so much faith in the chatterbait. Up next, we're going to talk about jigs. There's a couple different specific type of jigs, if you will. You have a swim jig, you have a flipping jig, and you have a football jig or a football head jig. A swim jig is this guy right here. So this swim jig, this head of when you hear jig, that's normally any hook with a weight at the front. So this would be a jig head. This is a little more streamlined. It's kind of taller, skinnier. It's slender, if you will, designed to swim through the water, through the grass, things like that. So this bait is not designed to be fish on the bottom. It's designed to be swam. It's designed to be retrieved constantly back to you. And obviously, when you have a swim jig, they're oftentimes accompanied by a trailer. I have a crawfish type on here. You can put a paddle tail swim bait on the back of this. Those are primarily two of your more common trailers. Also, you can use a Fluke if you want to. We talked about that earlier. This is a swim jig. Again, this is designed to be constantly retrieved, to be swam through the water. The other one is a football head jig. As you can see, the head of that is the shape of a football, if you will. And the way this works compared to the swim jig is it's not designed necessarily to come back to you. This is designed to sit on the bottom. That football head jig is designed to sit flat like this and throw these crawfish pinchers up in the air like that. So it's designed to sit flat on the mud, the rocks, whatever you're throwing it into, and have these legs up in the air. That's just a different presentation to the bass. You know, with a Texas rig, that weight's going to be sitting like this and it's going to be dragging behind the weight. With this football head jig, that's designed to sit flat like this and have this up in the air floating. Just a little bit different, but that's what that jig is utilized for. The other one I mentioned that I don't have is what you call a flipping jig or a pitching jig. The head of the jig is just designed to, in a way, penetrate through maybe some heavier cover, or if you're going to be, throwing around lots of brush, lots of structure, things like that, or if you're going to be pitching. When I say pitch and flip, I mean you're not making full long casts. You're flipping it anywhere from 10 to 20 feet away from you, and you're working around structure. You're being really precise with where you're flipping and pitching. And the jig is just designed in a way that it's not necessarily like a football head, very specifically designed on the bottom. Swim jig, very specifically designed to swim through the water. The flipping jig is kind of a hybrid, I think. I've not myself personally utilized one. I've fished primarily from a kayak, which makes flipping and pitching difficult, and the bodies of water that I'm in, I don't necessarily have the perfect flipping and pitching scenario. So anyways, that's going to be your chatter baits and your jigs. Really, really effective baits. Next, we're going to talk about spinner baits. A spinner bait is a very common bait. It's an effective bait. It's got a lot of different looks to it. It's got flash to it. It has, a lot of times people will throw a trailer on them, so it has kind of the swim bait feel to it, or the effectiveness of maybe some crawfish pinchers, or the paddle tail of a swim bait. But this is, when you hear spinner bait, this should be going through your mind. Okay, it's normally a jig head that's got a wire coming out and then a 90-degree turn. This is where you tie the line right here, and then you have these blades, right? And these work a lot in the water, creating shine, shimmer, vibration, things like that. There's 3 different types of blades here. This is a Indiana blade, which is a hybrid between a willow leaf blade and a Colorado blade. So Colorado blade is going to be a circle. So obviously this side here is circular, and then this side here comes to a point. That's where the willow blade comes into play. Willow leaf blade is going to be longer and skinnier, similar to the shape of a willow leaf, hence the name. So this is a hybrid. This would be considered an Indiana blade. It just depends. I don't throw spinner baits enough to know, oh, they really prefer the willow leaf blade or the Colorado blade. I don't really know, but there are lots of different options. And like I said earlier, a lot of times these are partnered up with a trailer of some sort. Right now I have on here a split tail Fluke. So when you think spinnerbait, that should be what you're picturing. Next, we're going to talk about topwater baits. There's lots of different options. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, there's different kinds of topwater baits. There are both soft plastic, then you also have hard plastic. So going back to what I was saying, there's lots of different types. There's topwaters that you have to pop with your rod. There's topwaters that are constant retrieve. There's topwaters that are walking baits, which create a lot of action on the water, but they're a lot of action with your rod. We're gonna start with a topwater Torpedo. It's got a little propeller on the back, which as you pull it through the water, right, it churns the water, and it creates a lot of noise and racket to where a bass is like, oh, what is that? Let me go check that out. This is a bait that you pop along the top of the water. You can probably do a constant retrieve on this. I do not. I normally pop and pause, reel, pop, pause, reel. Okay, so that is a topwater Torpedo style bait. Next, so this is actually river to sea brand, and they call it a Whopper Plopper. I also know Berkeley makes one, they call it a Chapo. Depends on who makes them, on what you call them, but the difference here is this one actually has I'm gonna say propeller, right, on the back, and it rotates around the metal shaft running all the way through the lure. And what this is as you're reeling this in, that tail is moving, right, and creating a lot of noise, particularly, and it's disturbing the top of the water. Again, just something for those bass to key in on and go check out. This bait is super effective. It's easy to fish. Again, this would be, I guess, one of the propeller type, if you will. It creates a lot of noise on the top of the water. So this would be a Whopper Plopper or a Chapo by Berkeley, again, depending on the manufacturer of the lure. Next, we're going to talk about a popper topwater. And again, this is kind of more of a category of topwater, but this specific bait is designed to be popped with your rod tip. If you can see, hopefully you can see that it's concave. There's like this concave surface right here at the mouth. I'm gonna say the mouth of the lure. And what that does is as you pop it, that thing digs into that water, catches water, and it throws the water out in front of the bait. It also, if you do it correctly, creates this really kind of a deep bloop sound is the best way to describe it. And so this bait is designed to be popped with your rod and then you pause. This is not a bait that you would constant retrieve. Really effective topwater bait, creates a different noise, displaces a lot of water, just creates some disturbance on the top. Oftentimes, man, the bass just annihilate it. While we're talking about poppers, they also make popper frogs, right? Again, the shape of the front of this frog is similar to the front of that bait in the sense that it's that kind of concave shape and it catches the water. This is a weedless version of this popper. Obviously, with these exposed treble hooks, you can't really fish it any other place than open water. However, this frog gives you the option of going weedless. If you see the hooks here, you can drag this across the hook tips right here and here. You can drag this across grass, which is really nice. Oftentimes bass will go hang out in vegetation, and so you can pop this along vegetation and catch a lot of fish. Also, similar to the Whopper Plopper, this is a frog by Booyah, but it's got this little paddle on the end, right, and it swivels. So similar to the Whopper Plopper, how it's got this propeller on the back, this frog is the same thing, except it doesn't have the exposed treble hook. So this, I guess you could consider this maybe a weedless option. Obviously, if weeds get caught up in this tail, it won't work as effectively. But this frog is designed for a constant retrieve as well. The tail of this thing creates a lot of noise, just again, a lot of disturbance on the water, and the bass key in on that. Last in my top water arsenal would be what you would call a buzz bait. This is probably my favorite lure to throw, honestly. It's kind of obnoxious and annoying when it comes to like a tackle box. It's just big and awkward. However, if the bass are biting topwater, this is one of the funnest lures to throw, man. This little propeller up here in the front is what buzzes through the water, right? So that's where you get the buzz bait. As you work this through the water works in that propeller, creates a buzzing sound similar to the Whopper Plopper. Just an easy fish, man. You cast it out there and then you retrieve it. There's no popping it or, you know, cadence or anything like that. We just throw it out and reel it back in. A lot of people will put some sort of trailer on the end of this, so you could put a plastic frog on the end, crawfish, again, swim bait. Plastic frogs are what I see a lot of people use for trailers. I personally have never thrown a trailer on my buzz bait. I think the buzz creates enough noise, but it's something that I probably should look into. I'm sure there's some buzz bait trailer fans out there, but this is a buzz bait. Very effective and a bait that I personally love to throw. Lastly, I want to talk about the term trailers. So I've hinted at it previously with a chatterbait, having a trailer. So a trailer is simply something that as you retrieve a lure, it obviously, this being the front, this being the back, it trails behind the lure, right? So this particular chatterbait has on a crawl style trailer, right? So as this chatterbait is retrieved back, these crawfish claws are in the back moving, right? Creating lots of little vibration and something to catch the fish's eye. I also have one on this swim jig. Again, the same thing as I previously mentioned on the chatterbait. You also can put them, I have it on this football jig as well. A trailer doesn't necessarily have to be something that has to be moving in the water. This is just a trailer I've chosen for this football jig. Especially with this being on the bottom, a soft plastic Craw is a good option, because, you know, if you put like a paddle tail or Fluke on there, typically paddle tails and Fluke style imitations are fish, right? And fish don't necessarily bounce on the bottom, crawfish do. So this is an example of a good trailer, not on a jig or a chatterbait. So they come separate, so you can get lots of jigs, lots of chatterbaits, but then you have to go get the soft plastic trailers. They are separate. If you have a soft plastic Craw as options, you have a paddle tail swim bait, as I mentioned, as an option. And then I also see people have Flukes as an option. As you saw on the spinnerbait, which is over here, I actually have this very Fluke on this spinnerbait as a trailer. So when you hear the term trailer, that's what they're referencing. So it can be a really effective way to spice up a lure that maybe is not getting a lot of bites. You know, if you have a chatterbait, maybe that vibration's not enough, but throw a crawfish on the back of it or a paddle tail swim bait, and man, that enough of that action and just a little difference there could be the difference between a bass saying, hey, I want to go eat that, and a bass saying, you know, I'll pass. So when you hear the term trailer, that's what it's referencing. Lots of options here. Really effective way to increase, in my opinion, the amount of hookups you'll get on those lures. Well guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope that was helpful, a little information for you when it comes to lures, the types of lures, what they are. I didn't go super deep into when to fish them or what to fish them in. There were a couple things here and there that I said, but again, the goal of today's video was simply just to provide information as far as, you know, hopefully you have a little more confidence now in reference to conversations you may be having with your fishing buddies, and they're talking about swim baits and trailers and jigs and spinnerbaits, crankbaits, all this stuff, and you're able to understand and know what they're referencing. So a little bit different for me. I'm not on the water, I'm not fishing, but I hope it was helpful and informative and can be utilized on your next fishing trip, on your next adventure. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it. Give me a thumbs up, give me a comment, subscribe if you like. I'll see you guys next time.